Hello everyone, my name is Mota, and before we get started I want to emphasize that this video is directed to somewhat advanced users. I'll be skipping over most technical elements here. The more tutorial part of this video will be less of a step-by-step guide, as it will mostly focus on my general process and approach. So the most important part of the video is right here with these 3 pieces of technical advice. So with that out of the way, let's begin on attaching texture coordinates to particles. Unfortunately, there's no tool in Blender as far as I know that is specifically meant for this sort of thing, so we need to improvise. To do that, let's look in the particle info node to find something useful. So we need 3-dimensional coordinates, gradients that describe the x, y, and z axes. And these coordinates need to be attached to the particles so that no matter where they move, the texture will follow. In other words, here we need to find at least 3 attributes assigned at birth to each particle that do not change over time or location. Well, we have index, random, lifetime, and size. Since random is assigned, randomly to each particle without any way to control it, it's not useful in this case. Particle index is the order in which they're born. This way, the first particle to be emitted has a value of 0, the second has the value of 1, and so on. Lifetime is a value that describes the number of frames that a specific particle will exist for, and size is, the size of each particle. So, all these are static values assigned at birth to each particle. To create the x, y, and z gradients, let's just start with particle size. That's the easiest property to visualize. So, to create the x gradient, let's give the particles a gradient texture. We want it to only influence the size of the particles, and you can leave the coordinates at generated or set them to an already existing UV map. Now, I don't want there to be a notable size difference between them like this, so I'll lower the influence to 0.1. This way, the smallest particles are only 10% smaller than the biggest ones. No visible size difference, but enough for us to easily use a map range node to remap the maximum and minimum particle sizes into 1 and 0. This way, in the shading process, we'll be operating on a much fuller gradient than just a tiny portion of it. Now we just need to do the same thing with lifetime, except with a vertical orientation to make the y-axis. I'll make sure to update the maximum and minimum values on the new map range node to correspond with the maximum and minimum lifetime. And now we've got x and y coordinates. Fortunately, particle index is a bit easier. The particles are moving in a stream, which means that the value is already growing in a steady gradient. Now, this simulation has about 20,000 particles in total. Knowing how the particle index increases by 1 for each particle, in the end our last particles are going to have the brightness of 20,000 minus 1. That's a bit much. We only need a gradient that goes from 0 to 1 or 2, so let's add another map range node to squish that into something more workable. Now all that's left to do is to combine these gradients into a combine XYZ node, and boom, textures that stick to the particles. But wait! What if my particles are being emitted all at once? How do I turn the index value into a gradient then? Well, I'm glad you asked, because as far as I know, it's impossible. Yeah, I'm really hoping for particle nodes to make this video obsolete. Moving on to secondary particles. The idea is to copy an object into all the particles and then use those copies as geometry from which to emit new particles. This isn't possible by going into the particle settings and rendering the particles as an object. The way that works is it visualizes and renders the current particles as another object, but doesn't actually create any real geometry in their place. The practical way to do this is through the particle instance modifier. What this does is duplicate the selected object onto particles. This time, however, it produces usable geometry that we can add modifiers to, including a new particle system. These are the settings that are usually useful in this modifier. They're pretty straightforward. I tend to disable dead and unborn so that the object is only duplicated onto particles that are currently alive. And it's also good to enable size so that they take on whatever scale is set to them in the particle settings. So there it is. All we need to do now is add a new particle system. Now it's behaving a little weird because it doesn't actually recognize the particle instance modifier. So to change that, let's just enable use modifier stack, and that's about all you need there. A quick thing to note is that secondary particles are incredibly buggy with object velocity, so that's a combo you might want to avoid. Oh, by the way, if you ever wondered if it's possible to duplicate force fields onto particles, yes, it actually is. This is something that I really wonder how particle nodes might handle it. Really interesting. This can be done in the force field settings panel. Just set one of the types into any force field in the list and boom, there it is. Effector amount controls how many of the particles act as force fields. 0 just makes them all have this effect. And self-effect enables the force fields to influence each other or the current simulation. I usually use this method by having a separate particle system specifically meant for this so that I can have a bit more control over everything. And I also tend to increase fall-off to keep their area of influence relatively small. So with these pieces of technical info, let me show you my general process in making particle simulations. Firstly, this is the reference that I'm looking at by the incredible Matthias M. I'm sorry for my Americanized pronunciation. A link to his page is in the description, along with links to several other artists I think are fantastic sources of inspiration for these kinds of effects. For the initial part, I'm essentially stealing this nebula effect that Matthias made here. Now, just by looking at this reference, let's try to think of a way to replicate it in Blender. For me, it's rather tempting to look at all these shimmering details and color variations, but that's never a good idea. Focusing on the details just leaves us overwhelmed along with distracting us from the more important elements. The details as a whole can only look good if the general structure does, so if we zoom out for now, we can see that the particles do follow an overall form. Now, I don't know how Matthias approached this effect, but one possible way to do this in Blender might be by just creating a mesh with a similar shape and emitting the particles from its volume. Now, usually there are multiple ways to create the same kind of effect. This one, for example, was created with a flat emitter going up and leaving this sort of tube of particles. So just because this is the idea that I got from looking at the reference doesn't mean that it's the only correct approach. Anything that gets you to the end result is a technically correct and valid approach. So if you came up with something different, then try it. See its advantages and disadvantages and see where it gets you. The way I created the emitter was quite fun, but not particularly important, so I'll skip over most of it. The plan was to create a path of vertices in an interesting shape and add some dimension with a skin modifier. After that, I transformed it into a volume object, so I could add some really wild displacement that would be impossible to do in a mesh. Lastly, I converted the volume back into a mesh, so now we have something useful for an emitter. A good thing to note is that Blender has a really hard time calculating the particle simulation if the geometry is highly detailed, so I gave it a decimate modifier to simplify it a bit. So let's go ahead and add the particle system. Now, I don't tend to organize my projects ever, but despite my immensely rebellious spirit, I have to concede that this is going to be a really complicated scene. I'll be naming everything and moving things into collections quite often. Because I want the particles to just appear all at once, I'll set the end frame to 1, and of course I need to get rid of normal velocity and gravity since I want these particles to remain unmoving for most of the time. Also, right now they're only populated on the surface of the mesh. Since I want them to appear inside the emitter, I'll change the emission source from faces to volume. However, you can see it's processing a lot slower than when we were emitting from just the faces, so I'll change it back for now. I'll switch it to volume again when we start getting into shading and rendering it. Since this will become useful in the future, I'm adding a particle object, a small mesh that these particles will be rendered as. For this, I usually use a cone with a total of 4 vertices because that's the least complex 3-dimensional object, so it won't be too difficult to render when we finally end up with millions of particles like this. I'll just name it, throw it into a new collection, and set the particles to be rendered as this cone we added. And there it is. Now, of course, we need to randomize their rotation, and I'll just turn on dynamic so that they'll rotate according to changes in the movement. For this simulation, I won't add any angular velocity, otherwise with the slightest movement, the rotation of the particles would change quite drastically, and that's not what I'm looking for here. Alright, I think I'll just get wacky and give these particles texture coordinates already. Usually I'd leave these sorts of things for later. It's always best to ensure that all the basic shapes and movements are there first, before you get into any of the fancy stuff. But in this case, it's just such a technical thing that I want to finish it already. Since we're emitting the particles at once, we won't be able to use particle index on this one. We're going to have to work with 2 axes, x and y. For the z-axis, I'll just use the global z-axis coordinates. This means that the textures won't follow the particles at all if they move in the z-axis, but at least there will be some depth in them. So let's get to work on the x-axis. As we saw in the beginning, we add a texture to the particle system, in this case a blend texture to create an even gradient, and we're going to have it influence the size. And again, I turned the size influence to 0.1 so that the particles all look the same size. So working on the y-axis, we're going to do basically the same thing. The only differences are that the orientation of the texture should be vertical and that the influence is set to lifetime. I had it at scale up until now just because it's easier to visualize. So of course, I'll again set the influence to 0.1 and increase the lifetime in the particle settings to prevent any of them from disappearing during the animation. Now this part is a little subjective, so not at all necessary for you to follow. I just didn't like how even the whole thing looked, so I wanted to add a turbulence force field that would only influence the simulation for the first second or two. That way we'd have a bit more detail in here. After animating the strength to 0 after 40 frames, I went to the particle settings and increased the dampening so that they would slow down to a halt soon after. That way, I'd be able to start rendering from frame 50 or 60 without seeing any weird turbulent movements in the particles. Anyway, let's check out the reference again. In terms of basic structure, I don't think we've missed anything. However, there are these particle trails here and there that add some interesting level of detail to the render. I feel like we can replicate that by having a few particles moving in these fun patterns and having them emit secondary particles, those being the ones to be rendered. Before we can have those secondary particles, we first need to deal with the primary ones. Again, I want these particles to be emitted all at once and of course without falling down. We can already see something rather inconvenient. This second particle system is being influenced by the turbulence force field that I made only for the first one. So the best way to deal with this is by creating a force field collection for each particle system. This way, different particle simulations will only be affected by the force fields in their respective collections. All we need to do now is go to the field weights panel and set the effector collection to be the one we made for this simulation. And finally, the second particle simulation isn't affected by the force fields of the first one. So let's start making the force fields for this second particle system. For this, I'm looking for an almost smoke-like motion. How about a turbulence force field? Well, using this hair particle setup, we can see how it doesn't produce interesting patterns. So instead, I'll try something else, namely a texture force field. I don't want anything too fancy, so I'll settle for a simple cloud texture. Every time you make a change in here, you'll need to go all the way back to the physics settings for the viewport to update, which is a little annoying. That's why I'm splitting the screen so I can go back and forth quickly. And here I'm just aimlessly changing the settings to see if I can get something that looks cool. I don't even know what Nabla does other than make the results somewhat less turbulent. Finally, the curl texture mode brought the kind of motion I was looking for. You can already see some twisting in here, and yeah, that's pretty much it really. Let's move this test subject into another collection and get back to the particles. So the movement is already much more interesting than what we had before, but there is one crucial thing to note here. These particles are in essence going to emit more particles in each frame. That's important to note because if one of the primary particles takes a leap from one frame to another, the secondary particles won't be able to form a proper trail, creating gaps between each location. So we need to make sure these particles are moving slowly. For that, I mainly reduced the strength of the texture force field and, well, it got to the point where I had to push the start of the render to frame 80 to give the particles time to have a more complete motion. Which is really not a big deal. We can extend the end of the animation later if it becomes necessary. Alright, so let's get to the particle instance arc of the manga. For the instance object, I'll just add a cone. There aren't many primary particles, so I could have safely added a sphere, but I went with a cone nevertheless. I recommend you also number the objects and simulations to remind yourself of the order in which everything should be cached. Now, after that, I gave the cone a particle instance modifier and, of course, selected the intended particle system. To clear things up, I disabled unborn and dead particles, although in this case, we'll actually want to leave dead enabled. I'm turning it off though so that it can become relevant later. We're not adding any UVs to the primary particles, only the secondary ones, so we can freely give these some size randomness. And while I was at it, I decided to randomize the rotation as well, which isn't necessary, but Anyway, let's move on to secondary particles. Let me cache this second simulation first, just to avoid any funky behavior later on. And as we went over at the start, Blender doesn't automatically identify the modifiers, so we need to enable use modifier stack to fix that. And as usual, I'll go ahead and minimize normal velocity and gravity. In fact, I don't want these particles to have any movement before that splashing effect towards the end. But I'll already create a force field collection for this guy just to keep things organized. I'll change the end frame to 80 because that's when the primary particles vanish. In fact, no, I'll change that to 79, which isn't really necessary. Blender just has a weird tendency to almost emit extra particles right after the primary particles have died, so I feel like setting the end frame to right before that would counteract it. Now I'm just changing the viewport particle size and their amount to get a better view of what's going on. I think it's already time for us to give this guy a particle object for it to render as, so I'll add another low-res cone and do all the organizing business. A lot of this stuff is kind of a grind, so I want to emphasize that if you're following along, don't try to copy the settings here. It's a lot better to experiment with these values until you get something that you personally find appealing, which is what I did. It took me a week to record all the screen cap content for this video because most of my time spent here was in experimentation, so don't see this part of the video as an exact recipe for this specific render. Alright, it's time for us to make the UVs again, same process, and whoops, we already find an issue. The gradient doesn't reach the boundaries of the simulation. Now, can you guess why this is? I do actually recommend that you pause the video to think of this because that's usually the best way to solve these tiny problems. The diagnosis is that the bounds of this object don't encompass the whole simulation. They only apply to the original instance object. Here's one way to solve this. See, the bounds of a mesh only extend as far as its vertices go, so all we need to do to make completely custom boundaries is to place two vertices opposite of each other. To determine where to put them, I just added a cube and scaled it around the particles. Now, any two vertices opposite of each other can be used to describe the bounds of this box. So just copy and paste them into the instance object, and boom, the gradient's already covering a much wider area. For whatever reason, this isn't very accurate, so I'm just using the color ramp feature to compress the gradient a bit. Moving on to the y-axis, the same story as before. What really matters now is what happens when I move around the timeline. You can see that right after frame 80, this effect disappears. There's no defined gradient. Since we set the primary particles to all have a lifetime of 80, this instance object pretty much vanishes after frame 80, leaving nothing for any texture coordinates to be generated from. If you remember from a few minutes ago, there is a way to keep the instance object still visible in the places of the particles that have died. Over here in the particle instance modifier. The nostalgia is extraordinary. Anyway, let me finish up this texture and increase the lifetime. I don't know why I had it so low to begin with. Alright, so far this is what we've created. As you can see, I've rendered a preview, which is crucial. Even though there isn't much movement going on here, getting an idea of how everything will be like in the end is vital. Unless you have a really unfortunate time limit, it's best not to speedrun towards the final result. Make sure everything looks correct before we complicate things by moving to more advanced steps. Having to change the shape of the emitter after you're already done with the shading would hurt. A lot. Anyway, there's a second part to this simulation I want to create. A sort of transition into this red, intimidating look. During that, the particles would splash in a liquid-like motion, which means I'll have to create a liquid simulation and make the particles follow it. Now, this force field here used to be called smoke flow. It allowed for particles to follow the movement of a smoke simulation. Recently, it's been changed to fluid flow, because, as you might have guessed, it also allows particles to follow liquid simulations. I know it's really annoying when I do this, but I have to, as these are pretty extensive topics. I'll skip over most of my fluid simulation process. It's just not what this video is about. Boom, in a new collection, I'll add a domain object. I made this mesh a liquid emitter. That's because I wanted a medium that these splashes could propagate and ripple through. Now, this irregular looking object here will be doing the splish splash. I'll animate it to have some wacky moves, making sure to add some initial velocity. Alright, I have everything set up for the simulation, so boom! Test bake. Gee willikers, it's going wild. Guess I can add some viscosity, oh yeah, and a drag force field to slow things down to a halt. I didn't want the simulation to just keep flinging itself forever. Boom, and bake again. Dang it, that's not what I wanted. Changing settings, and gosh golly, let's bake this bonkers. Eventually, after messing around for long enough, I got a result that looked pretty interesting. These spheres, by the way, are collision effectors. I just added them to break up the movement of the liquid a bit, just to prevent these parts from moving too much in straight lines. Also, I really liked this unexpected interaction here, where this splash slams through a part of the simulation. It was an accident I wasn't looking for, but I welcome it. I suppose it's time to make the particles follow in that movement now. I'll do this with the main particle system first, so I'll add a fluid flow force field into the proper collection. My starting values for strength and flow are 5 and 2 respectively. They're only good values to start with. I'll come back to change them later. Make sure to select the proper domain object. To avoid any possible glitchy behavior, I'll animate the smoke flow to only start having an effect when the liquid simulation begins, which is at frame 180. Frames before that would be before anything has been cached in the liquid domain, so it doesn't make sense to have the fluid flow influence the particles then. After the first test bake, we can clearly see that the force field only has a tiny effect on the particles before they slow down. This could be due to the flow factor being too high, but then I remembered how much we increased the dampening in the particle settings. We did that to slow down the initial turbulence. We don't need it to stay this high for the rest of the simulation, so I'll just animate it to go back to 0 in a few frames. Things are already looking a lot more interesting, but it's still clearly being held back a bit. It does look like the flow factor was a bit too high after all, so I'll just decrease it. Once again, it'll be this back and forth of baking and changing settings. The inescapable truth of computer simulations, I suppose. For the main particle simulation, I ended up with this result, which I think works quite well, so I'll just move on to the secondary particles. I'll duplicate the fluid flow force field and move it into the effector collection of the secondary particles and bake the simulation to see if we need to change any settings there. So yeah, this is what we got now. Moving around the timeline, we can see some really cool details all around. Alright, that was a lot. It's time to finish this up by briefly talking about shading. Why though? I mean, half of my time on this project was spent on shading, so why am I summarizing this? Well, when it comes to particles, shading is pretty subjective. Sure, if you're doing some more high-level stuff, there are right and wrong ways to deal with all the technical and mathematical problems. But when it comes to most of my particle projects, the shading is not so advanced. Time-consuming for sure, but to really explain all of this, they're just combinations of textures with different values and colors. Who's to decide on what's the right way to combine these textures, on what the correct values and textures are? Besides, if I were to explain all of the trial and error I did here, I wouldn't just obfuscate the point of this chapter, I would also be requiring myself to put effort into writing it, which is a big no-no for me. So while setting everything up, I gave the first particle object a new material and brought that same material to the emitter. It's nothing crucial, it just makes everything a bit easier to work with since I won't have to go back and forth between emitter and particle object. Alright, let's get the technical stuff out of the way. Let's actually create the UVs, the texture coordinates. With this particle info node, I'll use the lifetime and size outputs to generate the x and y coordinates. Let's look at lifetime first. You can see here it's set to 500 frames. Keep that in mind, it's the maximum lifetime the particles can have. And remember what we did with the particle textures, they only have a 10% influence on these attributes, meaning that the minimum value for lifetime is 450 frames. So I'll just type these values into a map range node, and it'll remap them into the values we have down here, 0 and 1. As you can see in this top view, we have a pretty neat y-axis gradient. Moving on to size, let's take a look at the maximum scale the particles can have, which is over here, 0.005. And since particle size is something that I end up messing around with a lot, I decided to use a math node so I won't have to multiply these numbers in my unreliable flesh brain. So now it's multiplying the maximum particle size by 0.9 to generate the minimum size. And if we take a look at this here, boom, an x-axis gradient. Dope. Remember, we couldn't generate a z-axis gradient, so we'll have to rely on global coordinates. In other words, the current location of each particle around the scene. If we separate the x, y, and z coordinates of the location output, then we'll be able to specifically focus on the z-axis information. As you can see, it's a little different from the other gradients we've made. Its zero value is centered a bit better so that above it there are positive values and below it there are negative values. Now, I apologize for the stupidity and pointless inefficiency you're about to witness. I could have just changed the lower minimum and maximum values of the map range to -2 and 2, giving us a range similar to what we saw in the z-axis, but for whatever reason I didn't notice that it was an option, so instead I decided to do the same thing but with a whole new math node. Alright, to finish the UV creation, let's just combine the x, y, and z gradients into something that we can use for actual textures. And on the topic of actual textures, let's do that. The first texture I'm focusing on would be for these large blue zones. I decided to start with a noise texture and some assisting nodes to help visualize it. I wish to move the texture around to get different variations of it, so I added a vector math node. No fancy math went into this. All I did was grab one of these values and cranked it randomly, which moved the texture and gave me a new pattern. That's what I spent my next 20 minutes on, mostly just messing around with the scale and location of the texture until I got something that looked interesting. And every time I got a result I wasn't entirely sure about, I duplicated the node setup for later use. Alright, so after a while, this is what it looks like. I've taken some liberties and added this second part, so just to summarize, this first part is the large-scale pattern, and this second part adds some finer details to it. They're both combined here with this overlay mix node. With the foundational elements out of the way, I started working on the colors and the brightness. So I went ahead and added an emission shader already, along with a couple color ramp nodes for the strength and color. When I got that to look okay, I moved on to these orange details that we can find around the reference. The textures of these details seemed pretty interesting, so I decided to change my workflow a bit. I do this a lot when dealing with bigger texture setups. My computer is way too slow at previewing this on hundreds of thousands of particles, so instead I'll use a simple plane for now. I found a Voronoi texture to be a good starting point here. And by the way, this texture coordinates node is temporary. After I'm done looking at the plane, I'll connect all this to the UVs we made before. For those who don't know, this is a funny thing you can do with textures. I used the color information of the noise and overlaid it onto the texture coordinates, causing it to distort them, which is a fun thing to play around with. I use these excess nodes to create finer details throughout. I hope you can notice the process of first focusing on the most striking patterns and only moving on to lower scales when there's a good foundation. In fact, I'm putting way less thought into these tiny details than I was regarding the blue patterns. The way the minute forms look in and of themselves doesn't really matter that much. In the end, they'll only look good if the basic structure does, so pay more attention to all the stuff one would notice from a distance. I had the idea of switching the nebula from colorful to pure red once the splashes appeared, so I decided to work on those new red colors and thought about how I would deal with the transition itself. I left this for the end because it's not a meaningful change to the structure we've already made. It's just a shift in colors, nothing that requires any special priority. A tiny thing I did was use the particle velocity to generate these bright zones as they moved. I felt like that made things a bit more dynamic by emphasizing the splashing. I used these two empties to guide the actual transition itself, so I put them into texture coordinate nodes, which I used to make these spherical gradients in their places. I'd use this as a sort of mask for the transition. Alright, the shading process is pretty much done. Of course, the second particles also need their material, but I'm speeding past that because it uses the same concepts as the last shader. Also, setups like the transition and fake UVs were essentially copied and pasted from the previous shader. After the shading, everything was essentially complete. Before I created a final render though, I first made a shorter test render to know if there's anything I should change before committing to massive waiting times. I highly recommend low-res test rendering like this, even if it's a bit annoying. The viewport preview can only go so far. It doesn't show you any of the shading, which is a pretty important element. Everything works in context. If the textures imply that the nebula is massive, then having the camera whoosh around it like this would make it a bit inconsistent. Eventually, I rendered out this final animation with a few changes made to it, like slowing down the camera and making a few tweaks in the shading. aside from increasing the particle number to 6 million. Another thing about this is that I rendered it in 4K despite this video being in 1080p. The reason is that rendering in higher resolutions really helps the particles look smaller. For instance, both of these images have a resolution of 1080p, but this one was rendered in 4K before being scaled down. Just a quick little idea I thought I'd share. Anyway, that's the end of this video. I know a lot of this might be confusing, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask. The project files for this tutorial and all the other particle systems you can see right now are available for free in the description. Do note, however, that a lot of these have multiple simulations that need to be cached in specific orders. I've also lowered the particle count for some of the heavier ones. I'd like to thank everyone for watching and give a huge thanks to all of my patrons.